So your painting should have completely dried by now. So I'm rubbing my fingers on it, no paint coming off. At least 24 hours, we want to let the underpainting dry. And we are going to start by painting from the top down. So generally speaking, with landscapes and painting, we want to start with our background or the things that are farthest away, and if at all possible, work from top down. Because oil paint dries so slowly, you don't want to risk dragging your hand across something. And it's really hard if you're working from the bottom, then trying to go up, because we also want to think about how objects are going to overlap. So we're going to start at the top. We're going to start with the sky. Then I would move into the mountain area. I would probably then do this meadow, at least getting base colors down, and then probably do the trees near the end because those are overlapping. And the reason you want to think that way is because if you spend a lot of time doing detail and texture on this tree, and then you have to try and go around it to get the color of the sky, it's going to be really hard to get the colors of the sky to blend or to make it look even when you're trying to work around a detailed object. So this way, when we start with our background and when we work from top to bottom, we have less issues. The other thing that we will also do is kind of work in sections at a time and let things dry a little bit in between. Because we are going to be mixing oil into our paint today, you'll have your little cup of oil. The paint is going to start drying very slowly. So it already, we know, dries slowly. So this is the paint that I wrapped up from the other day. So just so you guys know, for the sake of the video, it has been almost 2 days, I think, since I was here, and you can see the paint is still very wet. Hasn't dried out at all. And that's the nature of oil paint. It takes a really long time to dry out. So when I'm taking the plastic off, I want to be really careful to try and keep this as flat as possible. And then with the paint, the side that has the paint on it sticking up, maybe just gently lay that off somewhere. So my paint is still very wet. Again, it takes a really long time for oil to paint to dry. And to be honest, when you guys are done with this, whatever paint you have left is still going to be wet. And you will probably just need to throw it away rather than trying to wash your plate. So just kind of know that it's going to stay wet, and then once we start adding oil, it takes even longer to dry. So we are going to work through this in a few different sittings. So today the goal will be to try and get the blue of the sky done, a base layer for the mountains. We'll go back over this with some extra layers of paint to add some texture, and then a base layer for this kind of meadow grass area, and we'll see how far we get. But you will have to work it in parts because we are going to want some of these base layers to dry a little bit before we start doing the texture. Otherwise, everything blends together, and you lose a lot of your textures if your base layers are still really, really wet with the oil. So there's a couple things that I want you to be aware of when we start mixing with oil. So I've got my plate here. I'm going to be doing a bit of a gradation in the sky. So I'm going to start with this pure blue up at the top, have it be a little darker, and then it's going to gradually get lighter as we go. So I could mix some lighter shades of blue onto my paint palette, but I'm actually going to show you how to mix the colors on the canvas as you go. So you'll see that for the sky, and then we'll talk about mixing colors for different parts later on a little bit more. I've cleaned off my ceramic palette so I can use this for mixing colors because I am going to run out of space on this plate really quickly. So that's one thing to keep in mind. We're going to mix a little bit as we go. I'm going to use a bigger brush. That will make it easier for this large area. And then just so you guys kind of understand why we have to mix oil into the paint is I'll attempt to paint with just this oil paint right on the brush. So something that you'll notice is that it doesn't really go onto the canvas very well. It's very streaky, and it's because it's just not flowing. It's too sticky, it's too thick, and it's really hard to fill in the texture of the canvas when the paint is used straight from the tube. And that's why we have to dilute it with the linseed oil. So I'm going to show you how that works. You've got your cup of oil here. It is a little smelly, but not too bad. And so the technique that I like to use is rather than pouring oil into this paint, I only want to mix a little bit at a time. Especially, again, you guys only have so much paint. We don't want to waste it. And you potentially run the risk of wasting the paint if you mix oil directly into your whole blob of paint. So we're going to use a similar technique to the underpainting where we mix the oil right at the edge, and we're going to use our brush for that. So generally speaking, my technique for oil painting is to dip the brush into the oil and pick up some oil on the brush, and it's a little drippy, and then mix that into the paint. And so you'll see it starts to thin out a little bit, just like it did with the water. Becomes a little bit translucent, but now it's much less sticky, and you'll see as I go over here, it flows right onto the canvas. And for those of you who've did your assignments the way you're supposed to, you'll kind of remember the Bob Ross where he's pulling that color into the middle of his palette, and it's the same technique. So we're gonna start, I'm gonna cover up some of those green bits. And as you can see, it is gonna start kind of drying up again. And so that's when we go back and start putting some paint. And when it feels sticky on the canvas, that's when you know you need more oil. So I'm just gonna, again, dip my brush right into that blue paint and start working that in again. So the paint is somewhat translucent. You can kind of see in my brush strokes, and that's why we do the underpainting. That way we don't need to use as much paint because we've got this blue from the underpainting showing through. And so that just provides some nice depth of color, and we don't have to worry about white spots showing through. So it is okay if the paint is a little maybe uneven. So there might be some areas that are a little bit darker, and that's okay. So I'm gonna go along the top with this pure blue before I start mixing in any white to create some of my lighter values for my gradation. And again, don't forget to paint your edges as you go. Now for some of you, you might be thinking of doing a sunset for your landscape. Now there's a couple things just as reminders about color mixing. You know, when we look in nature and we see a sunset, we might see colors that are yellow or orangish that go into blue. Now that is great for nature. God can blend those colors, but we know that if you tried to blend blue and yellow and orange together, you would end up with a muddy green color. So if you are going to have something like a sunset or a sunrise, remember that your transition colors are going to be pinks and reds and purples before you get into the blue. So you might have yellow, orange, maybe a pinkish or a reddish color, a purple, and then your blue. So sunrise, sunset, remember to use those pinks and reds and purples in between your yellows and oranges and your blue layers. So at this point, I've got enough of this dark blue and I want to start lightening the color. So again, you could use your paint stick to kind of pull some white and mix it into the blue. But this is a color transition that I want to be a little more subtle. So I'm actually gonna mix in the white as I go. So what I'm gonna do is, again, I'm not cleaning my brush because I'm gonna be mixing blue anyway. So I've still got some blue on there. I dipped it in the oil. I'm gonna pull it into some more blue paint. But now I'm also going to pick up a little bit of that white paint and I'm just gonna blend it in. Because I have oil on my brush, I'm okay to use my brush for blending. So now I'm just gonna start going in here, and this is where the fun part of oil painting comes in and when the colors start blending together. So this is a really light blue and I want it to fade into this pure blue up here a little bit more. So I'm just kind of pulling that color up and I'm painting very lightly. So my brush stroke is very light and I'm just allowing those colors to blend together. And I don't mind that there's streaks, so there's some darker parts here. I'm gonna be building up the color more as I go, and that will all kind of work together to have some different tones in the sky. Now, one thing that I hope you noticed about this assignment is that this is not necessarily a photorealistic painting. We're not too worried about it being perfectly realistic. I understand, obviously, with oil paint and working from home, that's just not feasible right now. So we are trying to just make a beautiful landscape, learning techniques for oil painting, blending colors, creating textures. That is the objective of this assignment. So if it's not super realistic, that is fine. So it gets a little tricky around this tree because I don't want my brush strokes to go around the tree because I don't want this like triangle of a brush stroke. So I'm actually gonna brush kind of right over the tip of this tree. Now my underpainting is still showing through a little bit because my paint is more translucent, so that's good. I know where my tree is, but I'm just gonna bring that blue just a little bit over that edge because I don't want any white spots showing through. And again, I want my brush strokes to stay smooth and horizontal over the sky rather than having kind of those triangular brush strokes as I try and work around an object. So same thing for the mountain too. I'm just gonna overlap that edge just a little bit because I want to maintain my horizontal brush strokes. So I've lightened it up. It's almost whitish down here in this corner. So that's kind of the value that I'm gonna go for as I work down the other side. So I'm kind of just trying to blend my color. I'm going over it lightly. I'm not dipping my brush back in the paint. I'm using whatever paint is here on my brush. It will fill in the bristles of your brush quite a bit because you're working these layers and it forces that paint into the bristles of the brush. So you'll be surprised how much paint is actually still in here. So I'm just gonna go back and forth, picking up some white and some blue as I go, move my paint palette down so you can see. And again, as it starts to dry out, if the bristles start feeling sticky or you feel like the brush is kind of catching on the canvas, that's when you know that you need to go back and pick up some more oil. Now, one thing to be careful of with the oil is, as you can see, it has a little bit of a yellowish tint to it. Normally, that's not a problem. It will kind of blend right into your paints. However, if you use too much oil with lighter colors, especially white, you do run the risk of it yellowing the paint. So you do need to be careful that you're not using any more oil than necessary, which is the other reason why I like to mix with oil on my brush rather than pouring oil right onto my paint. So again, I'm going right over the edge of the mountains to again make sure that I don't have any weird brush strokes. I want to keep them horizontal. That will help the sky look flat rather than textured. I don't want a textured sky. So now what I'm trying to do is even out the gradations in color. So that way I want it to be relatively consistent in terms of where my darker blues are and then where it begins to get lighter. So I feel pretty good about where things are. There's a little bit of a darker streak followed by a lighter streak here. I've also got kind of a darker blotchy area there. So I am gonna try and kind of blend that out a little bit and see if I can even out the colors a little bit more. Okay, so I am pretty happy with this first layer. Now there's a couple things that I see, they might not show up in the video very well, but there are some darker streaks here from where the underpainting was a little bit darker or the paint was a little thicker in the underpainting. Now, because the oil has made the paint more translucent, I am still seeing that underpainting showing through. So there's a couple things I could do. One is I could wait, give this a day to kind of set a little bit, let some of the oil start to oxidize, and I could go back tomorrow or the next day with another layer of paint and build up that blue layer so it was a little thicker. The other thing I could do is think about ways that I could cover that up. So if there was one little spot, like there's a dark spot here, maybe that would be a good place for some clouds. So I could just put in a cloud over that spot, build up the paint a little bit, and go from there to try and cover up any blotches, or like there's a tiny bit of green still here from where I had on my brush. That's another place I could put a cloud there. I think what I'm gonna do for now is I'm gonna let this dry a little bit and see how the colors change overnight and then make a decision. So I might come back and build up another layer of the blue, or I might leave it and cover up those areas with clouds, but we'll leave it for now.